The slap cracked through the morning air like a gunshot. It wasn't loud, but it carried a silence that felt heavier than sound. The woman staggered back, her briefcase tumbling open, papers scattering like frightened birds across the courthouse steps. Officer Craig Dalton didn't flinch. He stood tall, hands still raised, eyes sharp with disdain. "Filthy animals like you should stay in the gutter," he sneered. Around him, two younger officers chuckled, phones raised to capture the scene. The woman didn't answer. She pressed a palm to her stinging cheek and looked past them, toward the grand stone columns of the Riverside Heights courthouse. The morning sun glinted off a bronze plaque above the entrance. None of the men bothered to read it. The Honorable Judge, Amara Lewis. She was 20 feet from her own courtroom. Amara had arrived early that morning, dressed in a plain gray suit instead of her robe. She liked the quiet before court began, the stillness of justice unspoken. Today she carried files for a civil rights case that had stirred the whole city. Yet now, standing in handcuffs, she felt the cruelest irony, being brutalized by the same system she had devoted her life to protect. Dalton grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back with unnecessary force. "Let's not make this worse," he said, snapping the cuffs shut. "You people are always sneaking where you don't belong." Amara turned her head slightly. "What did you just say?" He smirked. "I said you're trespassing, ma'am. And before you start crying racism, remember, I got it all on video." She met his eyes, calm, unblinking. It wasn't fear, it was focus. She was memorizing everything, the smell of rain, the sound of his voice, the names on their badges. At the edge of the steps, Bailiff Parker hesitated. He knew her face somehow, though the gray suit threw him off. Without the black robe and gold chain, she looked ordinary, invisible. Just another black woman being put in her place. Dalton shoved her forward. "You'll explain yourself inside," he said. "We'll see what the judge thinks about trespassing." The irony cut deep. The judge. As they dragged her through the metal detectors, rain began to fall outside, speckling the marble with dark drops. Her scattered papers, affidavits, court filings, orders signed with her name, blew across the steps, small white flags of injustice. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed. Dalton filled out his report, confident and careless. Female suspect, mid-40s, refused security protocol, became aggressive. Possible mental episode. His handwriting flowed with the ease of long practice. Amara sat quietly in the holding area, wrists red from the cuffs. Her face throbbed, but her eyes were steady, deep pools of contained fire. She had seen men like Dalton in her courtroom before, officers who believed the uniform excused their cruelty. They had all learned what real accountability looked like. So would he. Parker walked by the holding room, uneasy. Something about her composure unsettled him. He looked at the tray of confiscated belongings and froze. Her identification card gleamed under the harsh light. Judge Amara Lewis, Federal District Court of Maryland. He looked up, stunned. Through the glass, she met his gaze with a faint, knowing smile. Outside, thunder rolled across the gray morning sky. Inside, the balance of power quietly began to shift. None of them yet understood that before the day ended, the woman they mocked, handcuffed, and humiliated would walk back into that courtroom not as a victim, but as the judge who would decide their fate. Parker froze as the name on the ID burned into his mind. Judge Amara Lewis. He had worked security at Riverside Heights Courthouse for years. He had seen that name engraved on plaques, rulings, and the door of courtroom 4. Now, that same woman sat behind reinforced glass, wrists raw from handcuffs, treated like a criminal in the building she governed. He glanced toward the front desk. Officer Craig Dalton leaned casually against the counter, recounting his version of events to two deputies. Yeah, she got loud, started waving papers like she owned the place. Probably one of those fake attorneys trying to slip in, he said, laughing. Parker's jaw tightened. Every word was false. Inside the holding room, Amara sat still, composed, her breathing steady. The cold bench bit through her skirt, but she didn't move. Years in court had taught her how to control emotion, how silence could speak louder than rage. She wasn't thinking about the pain on her cheek anymore. She was thinking about evidence, about chain of custody, about how, within hours, she would turn every lie into a sworn confession. Parker entered quietly, holding a paper cup of water. "Ma'am," he whispered, glancing at the camera. "If you just give me a moment, I can fix this." Amara met his gaze. "No, Officer Parker. Not yet. Let them think they're in control. Justice needs witnesses." Her voice was calm, but it carried command, the same tone she used from the bench. Parker nodded slowly, understanding more than she said. Meanwhile, Dalton strutted down the hallway, confident, self-assured, already planning how he'd spin the story in his report. Female suspect, mid-40s, refused to comply with security procedures, he recited aloud. Possible mental instability. His words slid out with the smoothness of habit. By the time Amara was escorted into the hearing room, the courthouse buzzed with curiosity. Clerks whispered, guards leaned against the wall, and junior lawyers filed in just to watch. None realized the woman at the defense table was the very judge whose rulings filled their law books. Dalton stood at the front, crisp uniform gleaming. "Your Honor," he said to the temporary judge. The defendant was acting suspiciously near the courthouse entrance. When I approached, she became hostile and refused to provide identification. Standard protocol was followed. The prosecutor, Rebecca Hall, nodded approvingly. "Did she resist arrest?" "She did," Dalton said confidently. "I used minimal force." Parker watched from the back row, heart pounding. Every line, every gesture reeked of practiced deceit. He wanted to shout, to point at the bronze plaque outside that read, "The Honorable Judge Amara Lewis." But he couldn't. Not yet. Amara remained silent. Her eyes followed Dalton with measured focus. Every false word he spoke was another thread she would later pull apart. The bruise on her cheek pulsed with each beat of her heart. But it didn't humiliate her. It fueled her. Dalton mistook her stillness for fear. He leaned toward Rebecca. "Watch," he whispered. "She'll play the race card any minute." Amara's lips curved slightly. The first hint of a smile. Outside, rain began to pour, tapping against the courthouse windows. Thunder rolled across the sky like a distant drumbeat. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered, and tension thickened like a storm about to break. For now, Dalton thought he was winning. For now, everyone believed his story. But soon, the truth would walk back into that room wearing black robes and carrying a gavel. Amara sat tall, silent, eyes unyielding. She knew exactly how this would end. In less than an hour, the man who mocked her, hit her, and called her a filthy animal would stand trembling before her bench, learning at last what justice really felt like. The rain had eased into a mist, but inside the courthouse the air hung thick and heavy. Every sound seemed amplified, the shuffle of papers, the creak of benches, the low hum of fluorescent lights. Judge Amara Lewis sat motionless at the defendant's table, wrists still sore from the cuffs, eyes fixed on the man testifying before her. Officer Craig Dalton stood tall, his posture polished, his voice steady with practiced confidence. "I was performing standard security procedures," Dalton said smoothly. The defendant became aggressive, refused to comply, and appeared unstable. "My actions followed proper protocol." The prosecutor, Rebecca Hall, nodded. "Did she resist physically?" "Yes, ma'am," Dalton replied, without hesitation. "I had to restrain her to prevent escalation." In the back row, Bailiff Parker clenched his fists. He had seen it all, the slap, the shove, the humiliation, and not once had she resisted. But he stayed silent. In this courtroom, a uniform carried more weight than truth. Dalton's voice grew stronger. "People like this show up all the time," he said, shrugging. "They cry discrimination to cover their own misconduct. It's predictable." Murmurs rippled through the room. It was the story everyone recognized. A righteous officer, a disorderly suspect, just another case. But Amara was no suspect. She sat upright, shoulders straight, her silence deliberate. Each lie Dalton spoke became another note in the mental record she was building. The faint bruise on her cheek glistened under the lights, a quiet badge of what she'd endured. Judge Harold Franklin, gray-haired and cautious, studied her. "Ms. Lewis," he said finally, "do you wish to make a statement?" Amara raised her eyes, calm and unwavering. "Not yet, Your Honor. I'll speak once all testimonies conclude." Dalton smirked. "Sure. Gives her time to invent a better story." Rebecca gave him a warning glance, but said nothing. The room already leaned his way. To them, Amara looked like just another defiant black woman challenging authority. She read their faces, the faint smirks, the avoidance, the quiet assumptions. The same biases she'd seen from the bench 100 times were now turned on her. Parker shifted, restless. He wanted to shout her name, tell them who she was. But when Amara caught his eye, she gave the smallest shake of her head. Not yet. Judge Franklin shuffled his notes. "If there's nothing more, we'll move on to the officer's report." Dalton smiled broadly. "Thank you, Your Honor." The irony cut deep. The real Your Honor sat 10 feet away, listening as her own courthouse turned justice into spectacle. Thunder rolled faintly outside, rattling the tall windows. Amara's gaze flicked toward the sound, then back to Dalton. The storm was coming closer. He continued confidently, describing her erratic behavior and hostile attitude. Every word, smooth and false. Each line dug his hole deeper, though he couldn't see it. Parker's pulse quickened. Some officers chuckled softly, others whispered as if watching a show. They didn't realize the show was almost over. Amara clasped her hands tightly. The humiliation had cooled into resolve. The pain in her cheek was nothing compared to the fire rising inside her. Dalton finished proudly. "That's all I have, Your Honor." Judge Franklin nodded. "Very well. We'll recess briefly before continuing." The gavel struck. The sound echoed through the room, sharp and final. Amara exhaled slowly. The silence after it was heavier than any words. Outside, lightning flashed across the courthouse dome. Inside, beneath the glow of the lights, something unseen began to shift. The balance of power, inch by inch, turning back toward its rightful owner. The courtroom settled after recess, but the tension hadn't lifted. A storm still brewed outside, thunder grumbling over the city. and another was forming inside, quiet, deliberate, inevitable. Judge Amara Lewis returned to her seat at the defendant's table, her movements calm, precise. The bruise on her cheek was darker now, but her composure made it seem irrelevant. Her silence had begun to unnerve them. Officer Craig Dalton whispered something to Rebecca Hall, who nodded without looking up from her notes. He believed he had already won. The smug certainty of a man who had never been challenged was written all over him. Judge Harold Franklin cleared his throat. "Ms. Lewis, the court will now allow you to speak in your defense." Amara stood. Her voice, when it came, was steady and low, the kind of voice that made people lean in to listen. "Thank you, Your Honor." The first few sentences were measured. She didn't shout or cry. She began by addressing simple facts: the time, the place, the interaction. Her tone was surgical, every word deliberate. "Officer Dalton's testimony contained several inaccuracies," she said. "For instance, he stated that I was trespassing, yet the sidewalk where the incident occurred is public property under state law." A few heads turned. She continued, citing a Supreme Court case by name, explaining calmly that her presence was fully lawful. Each legal reference landed like a small hammer tapping cracks into Dalton's story. Rebecca frowned, exchanging a look with the clerk. Dalton shifted, suddenly less at ease. Amara gestured toward the evidence table. He also stated I carried suspicious documents. These are legal briefs and memoranda from the State Judiciary Office. All of them bear my seal. Judge Franklin leaned forward. "Your seal?" "Yes, Your Honor," she said softly, her eyes steady on him. "Because they were prepared for hearings I was scheduled to preside over this morning." The room went still. For the first time, Dalton blinked. Amara didn't stop. Officer Dalton also testified that his body camera malfunctioned. "I would like to request, under Rule 106 of the Federal Rules of Evidence, that all courthouse surveillance footage from 8:45 to 9:15 this morning be preserved." Rebecca stood. "Objection, Your Honor. The defendant can't issue evidentiary demands." Amara turned toward her. "A pro se defendant has the constitutional right to request exculpatory evidence, or are you suggesting the state should ignore Brady v. Maryland?" The prosecutor faltered. Judge Franklin hesitated, eyes darting between them. "The request is noted," he said slowly. Dalton's smirk was gone. Amara's voice gained quiet force. "One more correction. The officer claims I became verbally aggressive. That is untrue. Any statements I made were in direct response to being assaulted without cause. I was never informed of an arrest, nor was I read my rights." Each word cut clean through the room's false calm. A whisper of unease passed through the gallery. Parker watched, pulse pounding. Every sentence peeled another layer of deceit away from Dalton's version. Amara turned to the judge once more. "Your Honor, the truth isn't complicated. It's all on video, 15 feet from this very room. The law doesn't need emotion. It needs evidence, and the evidence will speak for itself." The silence that followed was absolute. Dalton's jaw tightened, his hands twitching against the edge of the table. Amara sat down slowly, her face serene, her eyes burning with quiet resolve. She had laid her foundation. The truth had entered the record. Outside, thunder cracked directly above the courthouse, shaking the windows. Inside, no one moved. For the first time that morning, Officer Dalton understood something he had never considered before. Justice wasn't blind. Justice was watching. The courtroom felt colder when the session resumed. The rain outside had softened, but the tension in the air pressed down like weight. Officer Craig Dalton stood stiff at the prosecution's table, trying to recover the authority he had lost. His voice, once full of arrogance, was now a whisper in his own mind. Judge Harold Franklin adjusted his glasses. "Before we proceed," he said carefully, "the court acknowledges Ms. Lewis's request for preservation of evidence. I will confer with security to verify surveillance footage." His tone was cautious, no longer dismissive. Amara inclined her head. "Thank you, Your Honor." Her calm was unshakable, her words deliberate. Prosecutor Rebecca Hall rose quickly, trying to regain control. "Your Honor, the defendant's statements are unfounded. There's no proof she has any legitimate connection to these documents." Amara smiled faintly. "Then perhaps I should offer proof." She reached into her jacket pocket, slow and deliberate. The guards tensed, but she withdrew a slim leather wallet and laid it on the evidence table. With a single flick, it opened. Gasps swept through the courtroom. Inside gleamed a gold-embossed seal, the insignia of the Federal District Court. "My name is Judge Amara Lewis," she said evenly. "Appointed to this bench in 2002. Reconfirmed last year. My courtroom is one floor above this one." Silence fell like a curtain. Judge Franklin went white. Rebecca froze mid-breath. Dalton's smirk vanished. Amara's tone remained polite, almost gentle. "Perhaps, Your Honor, we should recess while you confirm my credentials." Franklin's gavel came down weakly. "Court will recess for 15 minutes. As the crowd dispersed, Dalton stood rooted to the floor, his world unraveling. Amara turned to Bailiff Parker, who hovered near the back, eyes wide. "Officer, accompany me to my chambers, please." "Yes, ma'am," he said, the word catching in his throat. The sound of "ma'am" echoed like repentance. They walked the hallway together, the same path where she had been dragged in cuffs hours earlier. Now officers stepped aside, heads bowed. The corridor felt different now, reclaimed. Inside her chambers, Amara exhaled slowly. The walls smelled faintly of old paper and cedar polish, familiar and grounding. Parker lingered by the door, unsure what to say. "Judge Lewis," he managed, "I didn't recognize you." "I should have." She stopped him gently. "You saw what happens when power meets ignorance," she said. "Don't apologize. Just remember it." She picked up her phone and dialed a number. "Chief Judge Carter?" "It's Amara. I need a full backup of courthouse surveillance from 8:45 to 9:15 this morning. Every angle. Store multiple copies." There was a pause. "Amara, what in God's name happened?" Her voice was calm. Justice lost her sight. "I intend to restore it." When she hung up, Parker handed her a garment bag from her office. She unzipped it to reveal her judicial robes, the black fabric edged in gold. Carefully, she slipped them on. The act felt sacred, like reclaiming armor. In the mirror, her reflection looked both weary and unbreakable. The bruise on her cheek had deepened, a mark of both pain and defiance. "They wanted to teach me my place," she murmured. "Now, they'll learn theirs." Outside, thunder rolled again. The 15 minutes were nearly gone. She lifted her gavel from its box, tracing the engraving with her thumb. Justice is blind, but she sees all. "Parker," she said, her voice firm, commanding, "when we return, announce me properly." He straightened his shoulders. "Yes, Your Honor. The Honorable Judge Amara Lewis presiding." She gave one quiet nod. "Let's go remind them who's in charge." When the doors to the courtroom reopened, the atmosphere had changed. The same people who had laughed hours earlier now whispered nervously, unsure what to expect. The rain outside had stopped, leaving the windows streaked and gray. Inside, tension hung like fog. "All rise," Bailiff Parker announced, his voice firm, carrying through the chamber. The words struck differently this time, steady, reverent. "Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Amara Lewis presiding. Every person in the room stood." Officer Craig Dalton turned, expecting Judge Franklin to enter. Instead, the side door opened, and Amara stepped through. No longer the defendant, no longer the victim. She wore her black judicial robes trimmed in gold, the same robes she had worn for over 20 years. The bruise on her cheek was visible, deliberate. She walked to the bench with calm precision, her gavel resting lightly in her hand. The hush that followed was absolute. Dalton's throat went dry. He tried to speak, but only managed to whisper. "Your Honor." Amara took her seat. "Officer Dalton," she said, voice cool but clear, "you may remain standing." The temporary judge, Harold Franklin, had retreated to the side, pale and trembling. "Your Honor," he stammered. I didn't know." Amara turned to him gently. "Thank you for maintaining order during my absence, Judge Franklin. You may return to your docket." Relieved, he all but fled the room. Amara faced the courtroom. "We will now continue proceedings regarding the incident of this morning." She looked directly at Dalton. "For clarity, the court recognizes that I was the individual detained and assaulted outside this courthouse. Therefore, I will be presiding over this matter personally." The gasp that followed felt like wind through an empty hall. Dalton's face drained of color. Rebecca Hall fumbled her papers, struggling for composure. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular," Amara interrupted softly. "Yes? So, is an officer assaulting a federal judge on her way to work? Let's proceed." She lifted her tablet and tapped the screen. A large monitor flickered to life beside the bench. "This footage," she said, "was obtained from courthouse security cameras. Camera 7, to be precise. It captures the full incident from 8:48 this morning." The video began to play. Dalton's voice filled the courtroom, clear and cruel. "Filthy animals like you should stay in the gutter." The slap echoed. Laughter followed. Gasps filled the room. The officers who had filmed the assault shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Parker stood by the door, his jaw tight. Amara paused the video at the moment of impact. "Officer Dalton," she said evenly, "is there any indication of aggression from the defendant in this footage?" He stammered. "No, Your Honor, but—" "No aggression? No resistance?" she pressed. Dalton's voice broke. "No, Your Honor." Amara resumed the video. It showed him grabbing her throat, twisting her arms, cuffing her wrists. His laughter filled the speakers again, hollow and brutal. When it ended, no one spoke. She looked around the room, her tone controlled but laced with power. This court just witnessed an unprovoked assault, racial slurs, and gross abuse of authority, all committed on federal property. Rebecca tried to interject. "Your Honor, may I remind the court?" Amara raised her gavel slightly. The sound alone silenced her. "You may sit, Ms. Hall. We're far beyond reminder." Then she turned back to Dalton. "You once told me that people like me needed to learn their place. Consider this your lesson." Outside, sunlight broke through the clouds. Inside, the balance of power shifted completely. The courtroom had just watched justice rise from its knees, and this time it would not bow again. The silence that followed felt eternal. Every person in the courtroom stood frozen, as if afraid even to breathe. Judge Amara Lewis sat poised behind her bench, the gold trim of her robes catching the faint light that filtered through rain-streaked windows. The authority in her presence was undeniable now. No one could mistake who commanded this room. Officer Craig Dalton swayed slightly where he stood. Sweat traced down his temple. Just hours ago, he had strutted through these halls laughing. Now, every pair of eyes in the room was fixed on him, not with respect, but disgust. "Officer Dalton," Amara said at last, her voice controlled, even musical in its restraint. "You testified under oath earlier today. Do you recall your statement?" He swallowed hard. "Yes, Your Honor." "Excellent. Then you'll also recall describing me as—" "What were the words?" She glanced at her notes. "A disorderly individual. A possible fraud." Dalton's voice cracked. "That was before I knew who you were." "That's precisely the problem," she replied, tone sharpening. "You didn't bother to know. You saw a black woman with a briefcase and assumed she was less than you. You made a decision not of law, but of prejudice." Murmurs spread through the gallery. The reporters in the back scribbled furiously. Amara leaned forward. "For 15 years, I've presided over cases involving misconduct, discrimination, and abuse of power. I've seen arrogance in many forms, Officer Dalton, but rarely this pure." He tried to steady his hands. "Your Honor, Stop," she said quietly. "The evidence speaks louder than your excuses." She turned her attention to the courtroom clerk. "Play the second video, please." A new feed appeared on the monitor, this time from Dalton's own body camera. The screen showed him sneering, muttering before the confrontation began. "These people think they can walk anywhere. Time to remind her who's in charge." The footage rolled on. His words were undeniable. Rebecca Hall, the prosecutor, paled. Parker stood motionless, watching every second like a penance. When the video ended, Amara closed her tablet and folded her hands. "There is no misunderstanding here," she said. "Only truth." Dalton lowered his head. "Your Honor, I was wrong." Amara studied him for a long moment. "Wrong?" she repeated softly. "Wrong is forgetting a name on a report. What you did was violence, and you did it with pride." Thunder cracked again, distant but heavy. She continued, her voice calm yet cutting. "Do you know what justice looks like, Officer Dalton? It looks like this moment, the one where power meets accountability." The gallery was silent, except for the hum of the air vents. Dalton's uniform suddenly looked smaller on him, his authority stripped bare. Amara turned toward the bailiff. "Officer Parker, please take Officer Dalton into custody pending review of criminal charges. Assault, abuse of power, and perjury." Dalton looked up in shock. "Wait, Your Honor, please." Amara stood. "You told me that people like me should know our place." "Well, Officer Dalton, this is your place now." Parker stepped forward, voice firm but solemn. "Yes, Your Honor." He moved toward Dalton, removing the man's badge and gun before leading him away. As the doors closed behind them, the courtroom remained hushed. For the first time in years, those who had watched injustice in silence saw what it looked like to end it. Amara lowered herself back into her chair, her hands steady around the gavel. She had reclaimed not just her courtroom, but the meaning of justice itself. Outside, sunlight finally pierced through the gray clouds, spilling across the courthouse steps, the same steps where humiliation had begun that morning and where redemption had just taken root. The door closed behind Officer Dalton with a heavy thud, and the echo lingered like judgment itself. Judge Amara Lewis sat perfectly still, the weight of the gavel resting in her hand, her expression unreadable. The courtroom remained tense, yet no one dared to speak. Everyone had just witnessed a reversal so complete, it felt biblical. She exhaled slowly. "This court will now review additional evidence related to this morning's events," she said. Her tone was calm, but absolute. "The truth deserves a full record." The clerk nodded quickly, opening a folder marked Supplemental Exhibit C. The monitor flickered to life once more. The screen showed new footage, audio from Officer Thompson's body camera, which had been active during the incident. Dalton's voice was unmistakable. "Watch me put this one in her place," he'd said, laughing. Thompson's voice followed. "Man, she doesn't even know who she's messing with." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The audio played on, capturing jeers, the slap, the mockery. Every word exposed the rot behind Dalton's uniform. Amara tapped her pen lightly against the bench. "These are the voices entrusted to protect the law," she said quietly. Instead, they mocked it. Rebecca Hall, the prosecutor, stood shakily. "Your Honor, these recordings, this isn't standard procedure. There must be context," Amara cut her off. "There is context. The context is abuse of authority, systemic prejudice, and moral decay." Her words were measured, surgical, leaving no space for argument. She turned to the two remaining officers in the room, Rodriguez and Thompson. "You both testified earlier that Officer Dalton handled the situation with professionalism. Would you like to amend your statements?" Rodriguez hesitated. "Your Honor, I was told." "By whom?" Amara asked. Neither man answered. "Then let me remind you," she continued. "Perjury carries the same weight whether it's spoken by a rookie or a veteran. The truth will surface, with or without your cooperation." The two officers exchanged terrified glances. The truth was already here. It had simply been waiting for someone to say it aloud. Parker entered from the hallway, whispering something to the clerk, who handed Amara a printed transcript. She read it silently, then looked up. "It appears the Department of Internal Affairs has been notified of these recordings. I appreciate their efficiency." She set the pages down. "This courtroom has now seen undeniable proof of misconduct. But this is not just about one man's violence. It is about a pattern that festers when accountability fails." Her eyes swept across the gallery, clerks, attorneys, officers, citizens. For too long, silence has been easier than justice. "That ends today." Rebecca Hall tried again, voice brittle. "Your Honor, may I suggest the court adjourn until—" Amara's gavel came down, sharp and final. "No. Justice does not adjourn when truth arrives." The sound echoed like thunder. She leaned forward. "These proceedings will continue. Officer Dalton is now in custody pending criminal review. Officers Rodriguez and Thompson will be detained for obstruction of justice. The remainder of this department will be subject to immediate federal inquiry." Gasps filled the chamber. Some spectators began to applaud quietly before catching themselves. Amara rose slowly, the light behind her forming a soft halo against the rain-streaked windows. "This building stands for law, not hierarchy, for truth, not habit. And as of this morning, it will once again stand for justice." She lifted her gavel once more, the engraved words gleaming. "Justice is blind, but she sees all." The gavel fell, ringing through the hall. Outside, sunlight broke through the clouds, spreading across the courthouse steps where injustice had begun, and where, at last, justice had returned to claim her seat. By the next morning, news of the courtroom upheaval had spread beyond Riverside Heights. Reporters camped outside the courthouse steps where the assault had taken place, their cameras pointed toward the grand columns that now symbolized something far greater than one officer's downfall. Headlines flashed across every screen. Federal judge overturns her own assault case. Justice reclaims the bench. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with disbelief. Officers who had once strutted through the halls now whispered nervously, unsure of what might come next. In her chambers, Judge Amara Lewis sat behind her desk, surrounded by files and transcripts, reviewing every case connected to Officer Craig Dalton. Her face showed no triumph, only purpose. Bailiff Parker entered quietly, holding a sealed envelope. "From the Department of Justice, Your Honor. They've requested a full audit of Dalton's record." Amara nodded. "Good. Begin compiling everything. Incident reports, arrest logs, complaints, settlements. Nothing gets overlooked." "Yes, ma'am." Parker hesitated before leaving. "It's strange," he said softly. "Everyone's treating this place like a church today." "Maybe for once," Amara replied. "It finally deserves to be." As Parker left, Amara opened another file. Dalton's history unfolded in grim detail. 15 years on the force, 47 complaints, most dismissed without investigation. She flipped through pages of faces, young men, elderly women, working-class families, nearly all Black or Latino. The same phrases appeared again and again: resisted arrest, acted aggressively, refused to comply. She closed the file, jaw tight. Chief Judge Naomi Carter entered without knocking. "You've started a firestorm, Amara," she said, her tone a mix of pride and concern. "The Attorney General's office is calling this the most significant judicial action in decades." "I didn't start it," Amara replied evenly. "I just stopped pretending it wasn't burning." Naomi sighed. "You realize this goes far beyond one officer. Internal Affairs has already suspended 12 others. Federal prosecutors are investigating the entire precinct. Then we're finally moving in the right direction." Naomi leaned on the desk. "They'll come after you, you know. The unions, the political donors, the departments that profit from silence." Amara met her gaze. "Let them. If justice can't survive scrutiny, it isn't justice at all." Outside, the low hum of reporters' voices drifted in through the open window. Somewhere below, someone began clapping. It started small, one pair of hands, then another, until the applause grew, echoing up through the marble atrium. Naomi smiled faintly. "You've woken something in this city." Amara looked toward the sound, thoughtful. No. The people were always awake. The system just kept them quiet. Later that day, she convened an emergency session. The courtroom filled quickly, lawyers, citizens, even off-duty officers, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. When Amara entered, the murmurs stopped. "This hearing," she began, "is not about revenge. It is about reconstruction." She spoke of accountability, of reform, of the thin line between authority and oppression. Her words were sharp, but hopeful. Justice cannot depend on who holds the power. It must depend on truth, and truth requires courage. When she finished, the room stood in silence. No applause, no cheers, just quiet reverence. Outside, the setting sun cast long gold streaks across the courthouse steps, the same steps where humiliation had turned to redemption. In her chambers that evening, Amara placed Dalton's badge on her desk. The metal gleamed under the lamplight, a symbol of everything broken and everything that could still be fixed. For the first time in years, She allowed herself a small, weary smile. Justice, she thought, wasn't blind anymore. It was wide awake. 6 weeks later, the courthouse no longer felt like the same building. The echo of laughter that once filled the halls had been replaced by quiet determination. Posters outlining new ethics policies lined the walls. Every officer entering the building now passed beneath a newly installed banner. Integrity is not optional. Judge Amara Lewis sat at the bench once more, presiding over a disciplinary hearing, not as a victim, but as the architect of a new order. The defendant today wasn't Craig Dalton. His fate had already been sealed in federal custody. Instead, the seat before her belonged to his commanding officer, Captain Richard Haynes, accused of covering up years of misconduct. The courtroom was full again. Reporters lined the back row, pens ready. But this time, there was no hostility, no spectacle, only anticipation. Amara studied the man before her. Haynes was in his 50s, built broad and solid, a lifetime of authority hardening every gesture. He avoided her eyes. "Captain Haynes," she began, her voice steady, but edged with gravity. "You were responsible for supervising Officer Dalton. You reviewed his reports, signed his evaluations, and dismissed dozens of complaints against him. Do you dispute this?" "No, Your Honor," Haynes said, quietly. "Do you understand that every signature you placed on those false reports made you complicit?" He hesitated, eyes lowering. "Yes, Your Honor." The gallery held its breath. Amara leaned slightly forward. "Then tell this court why you ignored 47 complaints, Captain. Why did you let him continue?" Haynes swallowed hard. It wasn't that simple. "The department's culture. Culture is not an excuse for corruption," she interrupted sharply. "When leadership rewards silence, injustice thrives." Her words struck like stone. She turned to the clerk. "Read the summary of settlements tied to Dalton's arrests." The clerk stood. "Total of $2.3 million paid by the city in civil damages over 15 years. 28 cases dismissed due to lack of evidence or officer misconduct." The courtroom stirred with unease. Amara nodded slowly. $2.3 million. That is the price your department put on human dignity. Haynes closed his eyes, shoulders sagging. "We thought we were protecting the force's reputation." "No," she said. "You were protecting comfort, yours, his, everyone who found convenience in silence." Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Inside, her words landed like thunder. Amara turned toward the spectators. "Justice does not exist in paperwork. It exists in choices. Every signature, every unchecked act of cruelty builds a wall between law and humanity. It's time we start tearing it down." She faced Haynes again. "Captain Richard Haynes, this court finds you guilty of conspiracy to obstruct justice and failure to report misconduct. You are hereby stripped of your rank and referred for criminal sentencing." The gavel came down once, clean, echoing, final. The crowd erupted in murmurs. Some gasped, others nodded solemnly. As the bailiff escorted Haynes out, Amara looked across the room. For the first time in years, she saw something that had been missing. Belief. Reporters whispered the same phrase over and over. Justice served. When the courtroom emptied, Amara remained seated. Parker approached quietly. "That makes 13 officers held accountable, Your Honor." She looked up, exhaustion softening her expression. "13's a start," she said. "Justice doesn't count numbers. It counts courage." Outside, the setting sun poured light through the high windows, bathing the room in gold. The courthouse, once a monument to fear, now looked reborn. And as the doors closed for the evening, Amara whispered to herself, not as a judge, but as a woman who had endured and risen, let this light never fade again. 6 months later, Riverside Heights had changed. The courthouse that once symbolized silence had become the epicenter of reform. Every corridor hummed with renewed energy. The air carried purpose instead of fear. What began as one woman's humiliation had turned into a movement reshaping an entire city. Judge Amara Lewis sat in her chambers, sunlight pouring through the blinds, stacks of reports covering her desk. She flipped through one of them, a federal oversight audit detailing sweeping changes in the local police department. 12 officers terminated, 4 criminal convictions, 43 cases reopened. The numbers told one story, but the human faces behind them told another. Bailiff Parker entered, holding 2 envelopes. Letters from the Department of Justice and the ACLU, Your Honor. They're requesting your input on national reform policies. Amara smiled faintly. It's strange. People call it reform, but really it's just remembering what justice was meant to be. He nodded, and remembering who's supposed to serve it. Across town, the precinct that once housed Dalton's unit sat under new leadership. Community review boards met weekly, civilian oversight had real authority, and officers now trained under mandatory programs on racial equity and constitutional rights. Programs personally designed by Judge Lewis herself. Later that afternoon, Amara walked the courthouse halls. The marble floors gleamed, but what truly shone were the faces, clerks, young attorneys, and law students who looked at her with something between respect and awe. She passed a display recently installed near the main stairwell, a bronze plaque inscribed with her words, "Justice is not silent. It speaks when we dare to listen." As she approached the main courtroom, a familiar figure was waiting. Chief Judge Naomi Carter smiled warmly. "You realize you've changed the definition of judicial duty, don't you?" Amara shook her head. "No, Naomi. I just reminded everyone that a robe doesn't protect us from responsibility." Naomi handed her a document. "Congress is opening a federal inquiry into nationwide police misconduct. They're asking you to testify as an expert witness." Amara looked at the letter thoughtfully. "I'll testify, but not as a symbol. As a citizen who still believes the law can do better." When Naomi left, Amara stood for a long moment, staring at the courtroom door. It was empty now, but echoes of that day still lived in the marble, the laughter, the slap, the truth revealed. She could almost hear the gavel striking, the sound that had restored balance to a broken system. Outside, the media still covered her story. They called her the judge who fought the badge, or the woman who taught justice to see. But Amara never sought titles. What she cared about was permanence, the assurance that the changes wouldn't fade once the cameras stopped rolling. At dusk, Parker returned one last time, holding a small velvet box. "This came for you, Your Honor, from the mayor's office." Inside was a medal inscribed, "For courage in the pursuit of justice." Amara traced the words gently with her thumb. "Courage," she murmured. "It's such a fragile thing until someone uses it." Parker smiled. "You made the city believe again." She looked out the window where twilight bathed the courthouse in gold. "Belief is powerful, Parker. But belief without action is only comfort. Justice needs both." As the first evening lights flickered on across Riverside Heights, the courthouse bell tolled. Its echo rolled through the streets, A reminder, not of victory, but of vigilance. Amara returned to her desk, opened her journal, and wrote one final line before closing it for the night. Justice never sleeps. It only waits for the brave to wake it. 1 year later, the Riverside Heights Federal Courthouse stood transformed. The marble steps where Judge Amara Lewis had once been struck now bore a bronze inscription. Here, justice found her voice. People came daily, students, activists, citizens who once feared the system, to take photos or simply stand in silence. The place that had symbolized cruelty now represented change. Inside, the courthouse had become a hub of reform. New murals depicted scales of justice balanced by human hands. Courtrooms hosted workshops on accountability and civil rights. Even the officers' uniforms had changed. Lighter colors, body cameras fully visible. Riverside Heights had learned that the law could wound, but it could also heal. Judge Lewis arrived early as always, carrying her worn leather briefcase. Her chambers were filled with letters, handwritten notes from exonerated defendants, law students, and families thanking her for restoring their faith in fairness. She read them not for pride, but for purpose. Each story reminded her why she'd never walked away. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Your Honor," Bailiff Parker said softly, "the dedication ceremony is about to start." Amara nodded. "Thank you, Parker. I'll be down shortly." Before leaving, she glanced at the mirror. The faint scar on her cheek caught the light. It was barely visible now, but she never considered covering it. It had become her reminder that justice, like healing, often left a mark. Outside, sunlight spilled over the plaza where a stage had been set. The crowd stretched across the steps, police officers, city officials, families, and children holding small signs painted with her words. Truth needs courage. The choir's soft harmonies drifted over the morning air. Mayor Whitmore stepped forward first. A year ago, this courthouse was the scene of outrage and disbelief. Today, it stands as proof that truth can rebuild what arrogance destroys. Judge Amara Lewis did not just survive injustice, she transformed it into law. Applause rippled through the audience, quiet, but full of feeling. Cameras clicked, but Amara seemed detached from the noise. Her eyes were on the people, those who had doubted justice and now believed again. When it was her turn to speak, she approached the podium with her gavel in hand. "What happened on these steps wasn't the end of a story," she began. "It was the start of one. Justice isn't a monument carved in stone. It's a living promise, one we must keep renewing." She looked toward the uniformed officers standing at attention. Power without empathy is tyranny. Law without accountability is failure. But when truth and courage walk together, even broken systems can be healed. The crowd fell silent, then rose in applause, not wild, but unified, steady, like a heartbeat. Afterward, as others mingled, Amara stood apart, gazing at the inscription on the steps. The wind stirred her robes. Here, justice found her voice, she whispered, and she will never lose it again. That evening, in her quiet chambers, Amara recorded a short message for the courthouse archive. "If you're hearing this," she said, "remember, justice is not blind. She watches, waits, and acts through those brave enough to speak." She paused, her eyes glimmering. Change begins when one person refuses to stay silent. She closed her notebook and looked outside. The plaza lights shone against the dusk, their glow reflecting off the bronze letters that bore her legacy. Later that night, her recorded words played on the courthouse screen. People stopped to listen, some in tears, others silent, all aware they were witnessing history. And in Riverside Heights, justice no longer whispered. It spoke. If you believe courage can change systems, share this story. Comment what justice means to you. Like, subscribe, and keep the light alive, because justice never ends. It begins with you.